Spring, 1874, Arizona Territory. The world was made of heat, dust, and the relentless clatter of iron on iron. Inside the last freight car of a westward-bound train, the air was thick enough to chew. Sunlight, dense with swirling particles of red earth, slashed through the gaps in the wooden slats, striping the floor in patterns that shifted and swayed with the violent rhythm of the journey. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down, baking the smell of sun-beaten wood and old cargo into the very bones of the car. In one corner, slumped but not relaxed against a stack of crates, sat a man. He was tall, even sitting down, with a kind of long-limbed frame that looked like it was forged for a saddle. His name was Jedediah Callahan, though few people ever used the full version. Most just called him Callahan, if they called him anything at all. He was a man who invited silence. His face, shadowed by the brim of a sweat-stained hat, was a map of hard miles and quiet observation. A neatly trimmed but thick beard and mustache covered a jaw that looked as unforgiving as the landscape outside. His clothes were practical, not for show, a dust-caked duster that had once been a dark brown, a simple cotton shirt, and worn leather trousers tucked into scuffed boots. He carried his solitude like a shield, a deliberate choice he'd made years ago. He was in Arizona Territory for one reason: to deliver a string of 20 prime horses to a rancher near Prescott. The job paid well, and once the money was in his hand, he would be gone, another ghost passing through the territory. He didn't look for trouble, he didn't look for company, and he damn sure didn't look for attachments. The train groaned, its wheels screaming against a curve in the track, the sound a brief, sharp agony before it settled back into its percussive, hypnotic beat. Jed shifted slightly, the leather of his gun belt creaking in protest. He wasn't asleep. He never truly slept on a job, not in a place where a man's life could be worth less than the contents of his pockets. He was simply enduring, his gaze fixed on nothing, his thoughts on the trail ahead. That's when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the train's symphony of noise, a scrape of leather on wood, a muffled thud, then a gasp, sharp and desperate, quickly stifled. Jed's body tensed, a coiled stillness that was more menacing than any sudden movement. His hand, which had been resting on his knee, drifted down to his thigh, fingers brushing the worn handle of the Colt Peacemaker holstered there. He didn't draw. Drawing was a statement. This was just a precaution. His eyes, a pale, clear blue that seemed startling in his sun-darkened face, narrowed as they scanned the shadowed recesses of the freight car. A shape detached itself from the gloom near the sliding door. It was small, slight, and moved with the frantic, terrified energy of a cornered rabbit. It was a girl. No, a young woman, though it was hard to tell her age beneath the grime and the fear. She scrambled further into the car, stumbling over a loose floorboard and catching herself against a wooden beam, her breath coming in ragged, painful bursts. Her dress, once a decent calico print, was torn at the hem and stained with dirt and sweat. Her hair, a pale blonde, had escaped its pins and hung in tangled, dusty strands around a face smudged with dirt and streaked with the clean tracks of recent tears. But it was her eyes that held him. They were wide, the color of a summer sky just before a storm, and they were filled with a terror so profound it seemed to have burned away everything else. She pressed herself into the shadows, making herself as small as possible, her chest heaving as she fought for silent breaths. For a moment, she didn't see him. Her attention was focused entirely on the door she'd just come through, as if expecting the devil himself to follow. Then her gaze swept the car and landed on him. Her body went rigid, a new wave of fear washing over her. She saw not a potential savior, but another man, large and armed, another potential threat in a world that had proven to be full of them. A small, wounded sound escaped her lips, and she shrank back further, her knuckles white where she gripped the rough wood of the wall. Jed remained perfectly still. He let the silence stretch, broken only by the rocking of the train. He watched her, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. He saw the desperate flight in her, the exhaustion that went clear to the bone. He'd seen that look before, on wild horses that had been run too hard, their spirits on the verge of breaking. Trouble had a scent, and this girl was soaked in it. His every instinct, honed by years of solitary survival, told him to ignore her, to become a part of the shadows, to let her and her problems pass him by like the fleeting landscape. She must have seen something in his stillness, not kindness, perhaps, but a lack of immediate aggression because her posture changed. The rigidity eased into a desperate plea. She took one hesitant step forward, then another, her movement slow and deliberate, as if approaching a wild animal she was afraid to startle. She stopped a few feet from him, her hands clasped together so tightly it seemed she might break her own fingers. She swallowed, her throat working. Her voice, when it came, was a raw whisper, barely audible over the noise of the wheels. "Sir!" He didn't answer. He just watched. She took another shaky breath, her wide, terrified eyes locked on his. "Sir, may I slip under your coat?" The question hung in the hot, dusty air. It was a strange request, intimate and desperate. She wasn't asking for protection in a fight. She was asking for invisibility. She was asking to disappear. Jed's gaze held hers for a long, silent moment. He saw the truth of her fear. This wasn't a trick. It wasn't a ruse. This was a soul at the end of its rope, making one last, desperate grasp for a hold. He thought of the quiet life he'd built, the simple rules he lived by. Rule number 1 was to mind his own business. Getting involved was a fatal mistake. He weighed the certainty of his solitude against the raw, undeniable plea in her eyes. He didn't nod. He didn't speak. He simply lifted the edge of his heavy wool duster, a silent invitation. The relief that flooded her face was so powerful it was almost painful to watch. It was as if a rope holding her taut had been cut. With a choked sob she didn't have the energy to voice. She scrambled the remaining distance and ducked under the heavy fabric, pressing herself against his side. She was trembling, a fine, continuous tremor that ran through her whole body. She was small against him, all sharp angles and fragile bones. He could feel the frantic, rabbit-fast beat of her heart against his ribs. He lowered the coat back into place, creating a dark, warm cocoon. The world outside the duster disappeared for her. For him, it had just become infinitely more complicated. He could smell the dust and fear on her, but underneath it, there was the faint scent of rain-washed sage, as if she'd been sleeping in the open, a stray strand of her hair, soft as silk, brushed against his chin. He remained as still as a stone wall, his body a rigid shield between her and whatever she was running from. He kept his gaze fixed on the shifting slats of light, his senses on high alert. He had broken his first and most important rule. He didn't know why. He only knew that for now. He was no longer alone in the dust. They sat like that as the miles rolled by. A silent statue of a man with a hidden, trembling secret. The sun climbed higher, turning the inside of the freight car into an oven. Sweat trickled down Jed's temples from under his hat. But he didn't move, didn't wipe it away. He could feel her breathing begin to steady, the frantic pounding of her heart slowing to a less panicked rhythm. The initial terror was giving way to sheer, bone-deep exhaustion. Her slight weight sagged more heavily against him, her head eventually coming to rest against his shoulder. She had fallen into the sleep of the utterly spent, a deep, oblivious slumber born of desperation and a fleeting, fragile sense of safety. Jed Callahan stared out at the blur of baked earth, saguaros, and endless, indifferent blue sky. He was a man who delivered horses, a man who moved through the world without leaving a trace. But now, trouble was asleep under his coat, and he had a feeling that when it woke up, it would know his name. The train rattled on, a metronome marking the passage of an unforgiving sun across a bleached sky. An hour passed, then another. The girl, Eva remained asleep, her body limp with an exhaustion so complete it seemed to have stolen her very substance. Jed had not moved a muscle. He was a man accustomed to long periods of stillness, to waiting out a storm or waiting for a skittish horse to trust him. This was no different. Yet it was entirely different. Her presence was a weight, not on his side, but in the air itself. It was a complication he had willingly accepted, and the question of why he had done so was a low, troubling hum in the back of his mind. He was watching the light change, noting the subtle shift in the angle of the sunbeams, when a new sound cut through the train's rhythm. It was the grating slide of the heavy door to the next car, followed by the thud of heavy boots on the carriage floor. Voices, low and guttural, carried on the hot air. They were not the voices of railroad men. Instantly, the sleeping form beside him went rigid. It was as if his own tension had flowed directly into her. Her eyes snapped open, wide and stark with remembered terror. She didn't make a sound, but a sharp, panicked breath hissed through her teeth. Her small hands, which had been resting loosely, clenched into fists. Grabbing a handful of his duster, she tried to press herself further into his side, to somehow melt into his frame and vanish from sight. He could feel the violent, frantic thumping of her heart resume, a frantic drumbeat against his ribs. Jed didn't look down at her. His gaze was fixed on the far end of the car, his head tilted just enough to listen. His body remained a bulwark of calm, but inside, every nerve was awake and humming. His right hand rested on his thigh, a casual posture that put his fingers inches from the handle of his Colt. The peace he had cultivated for so long had been a fragile thing, and it was about to shatter. The connecting door to their car slid open with a screech of tortured metal, flooding the dim space with harsh, intrusive light. 3 figures stood silhouetted against the glare. As they stepped inside, their forms took shape, and the scent of stale whiskey and unwashed bodies preceded them. They were exactly the kind of men Jed had spent his life avoiding. The one in the lead was a man named Silas. He carried himself with a swagger that didn't quite cover the rot underneath. His vest was brocade, though stained and frayed, and a silver chain looped across his stomach. A pearl-handled revolver was strapped low on his hip, more for show than for a fast draw. A greasy smile was plastered on his face, but it never reached his cold, calculating eyes. Flanking him were 2 others. One was a mountain of a man, thick-necked and slow-eyed, his knuckles scarred and his face a mask of dull brutality. His name was Bart, and he looked like he could crush a man's skull with one hand and forget about it by dinner. The other, Finn, was the opposite, wiry, nervous, with eyes that darted everywhere, constantly assessing, constantly looking for an angle or an escape. He was the kind of man who would shoot you in the back for the coins in your pocket. They moved into the car, their boots kicking up clouds of dust. Finn immediately started peering into the shadowed corners, behind crates and barrels, his movements quick and rodent-like. Bart stood impassively behind Silas, his big hands hanging loosely at his sides, a silent promise of violence. Silas's eyes scanned the car and settled on the solitary figure of Jed Callahan. He took in the worn duster, the good hat, the solid stillness of the man beneath it. His greasy smile widened. "Well now," Silas drawled, his voice oily. "Just a dusty traveler catching a bit of shade. A smart man in this heat." Jed said nothing. He didn't even seem to breathe. His eyes, pale and unwavering, met Silas's from beneath the brim of his hat. Silas took a few steps closer, his boots crunching on the gritty floor. He stopped 10 feet away, tilting his head. "We seem to have misplaced some property. A small thing, blonde hair, blue eyes. Might look a little scared. You ain't seen anything like that scurry through here, have you, friend?" The word property hung in the air, thick and ugly, beneath the coat. Eva flinched as if struck. Her breath hitched, and she buried her face deeper into the rough wool of Jed's duster, her whole body trembling. Jed could feel her terror, a living thing vibrating against him. He still didn't speak. He simply held Silas's gaze. He did not deny or confirm. He offered nothing. His silence was a wall, smooth and high and impossible to climb. It was more unnerving than any threat. Silas's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He was used to men who blustered or men who cowered. This quiet, unblinking stillness was something else. It was like looking at a rock formation that had been there for 1,000 years and would be there for 1,000 more. Indifferent to the wind and the rain. A man of few words. "I see," Silas pressed, trying to regain his footing. He gestured vaguely with his thumb. "See, this property. It belongs to a very important man. A man who gets what he's owed. There's a handsome reward for its return." Finn had finished his search of the corners, and now his twitchy gaze fell on Jed. He noticed the bulk under the man's coat, the way the fabric was tinted unnaturally. His eyes narrowed, and he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to Silas. Silas saw it. His gaze dropped from Jed's eyes to the duster, his smile turning predatory. "My, that's a heavy coat for a hot day like this. You hiding something under there, friend a stray dog, maybe, or something a little more valuable." He took another step forward. Bart shifted his weight, his right hand moving to rest on the butt of his own gun. The air in the car grew thick and heavy, charged with the promise of bloodshed. And then Jed moved. It was not a large movement. He didn't reach for his gun. He simply shifted his weight, leaning forward just an inch, bringing his face out of the deep shadow of his hat brim. For the first time, Silas and his men got a clear look at him. They saw the lines etched on his face. Lines that spoke not of age, but of hard miles and harder decisions. They saw the cold, clear certainty in his pale blue eyes. It was not the hot glare of anger or the wild look of fear. It was something far more dangerous. It was the look of a man who had weighed the cost of what was about to happen and had already accepted it. It was the look of a man who had nothing left to lose and who would take everyone else with him into the abyss. It was a look that didn't just challenge them. It dismissed them. It told them that if they took one more step, the next sound they heard would be the final thunderclap of their own lives ending. The silence that followed was absolute. The clatter of the train wheels seemed to fade into the background. Silas stared into those eyes, and the cheap bravado drained from his face, replaced by a flicker of genuine, primal fear. He was a bully and a scavenger, not a wolf. He preyed on the weak, the scared, the isolated. He was not prepared for this. This silent, still man was not prey. He was a predator, resting, and they had just kicked his stone. Bart, the big man, felt it too. He had seen that look before, in the moments before a gunfight turned deadly. His hand froze on his pistol. Even the twitchy Finn became unnaturally still, his darting eyes now fixed on Jed's, like a rabbit mesmerized by a snake. Silas was the first to break. He forced a dry, cracking laugh that sounded like stones grinding together. "Well, no need to get unfriendly. Just asking a simple question." He took a slow, deliberate step back, raising his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. "You keep to your corner, traveler. We'll keep searching down the line." He didn't wait for a reply. He turned, his swagger now forced and clumsy, and strode toward the door at the other end of the car. Bart followed without a backward glance. But Finn hesitated, casting one last, nervous look at Jed before scurrying after his companions. The door slid shut behind them, and their footsteps receded, muffled by the constant noise of the train. They were gone. The tension in the car did not vanish. It lingered, a foul residue in the air. For a long moment, Jed did not move, his eyes still fixed on the door, his body still coiled and ready. He listened until he could no longer hear their voices, only the sound of iron and wood. Slowly, deliberately, he leaned back, settling into his original position. The immense, silent pressure he had exerted seemed to retract back into him, leaving only the quiet man in the corner. Beneath his coat, Ava finally let out the breath she had been holding. It came out as a long, shuddering sob that racked her entire body. The terror, held at bay by the immediate threat, now flooded through her in a devastating wave. She didn't cry out loud, but a series of deep, silent tremors shook her frame. She was still clutching his coat, her knuckles bone white, as if he were the only solid thing in a world that was trying to tear her apart. He felt her silent breakdown, the raw agony of her fear. He waited until the worst of the shudders had passed. Then, in the dusty silence of the freight car, she spoke, her voice so faint it was little more than a whisper of moving air against his chest. "Please," she breathed, the words fractured by a sob. "Please, don't let them take me." It was not a question. It was a prayer, offered up in the dark. Jed looked down at the top of her head, at the strands of dusty blonde hair pressed against his shirt. He still didn't have the words she might have wanted to hear. No promises of safety or comfort. He wasn't a man who dealt in such currencies, but he could offer something else. He slowly raised his left hand and placed it gently on her trembling shoulder. His hand was large and calloused from rope and rain, but the touch was surprisingly gentle. He gave a slight, firm squeeze. It was a simple gesture, nothing more, but in the silent, sun-baked world of the freight car, it was an answer. It was a promise. It said, clear as any spoken word, "They won't, not while I'm here." The press of his hand on her shoulder was the only anchor in a world that had dissolved into pure terror, for minutes that stretched into an eternity. Ava remained huddled under the duster, listening. The sounds of the train were a constant, but now she listened for something else, the scrape of a boot, the murmur of a voice, the grating slide of a door. There was nothing. The silence from her hunters was more menacing than their threats. Jed's stillness was absolute. He was a statue carved from granite, but she could feel the tension humming through him. He was listening, too. His head was cocked at an angle, his whole being focused on the sounds and the lack of sounds from the rest of the train. The air grew stale and thick. The brief moment of relief after the men had left was gone, replaced by the suffocating certainty that they had not given up. They were regrouping. They were planning. The train was no longer a refuge. It was a rolling cage, and they were trapped inside with the wolves. Suddenly, his hand tightened on her shoulder. It wasn't a comforting squeeze this time. It was a command. "Stay quiet," he murmured, his voice a low rumble so close to her ear it was more a vibration than a sound. It was the first time he had spoken directly to her. He shifted, and the coat fell away from her. The light, even the dusty, slatted light of the freight car, was a physical shock after the darkness. He was already moving, his actions economical and precise. He slid from his seat against the crates and moved to the large sliding door of the car. It was the one she had scrambled through, the one that opened to the vast, unforgiving landscape. He put his hands on the heavy wooden beam that served as a lock, his muscles flexing under his shirt as he began to work it free. The mechanism was rusted and stiff. It groaned in protest, a sound that seemed deafeningly loud in the tense silence. Ava's heart leaped into her throat. Surely they would hear. She scrambled to her knees, watching him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. What was he doing? He glanced back at her, and his eyes held a stark, simple message. Trust me. With a final, jarring clank, the lock came free. Jed put his shoulder to the heavy door and shoved. It resisted, then slowly, grudgingly, began to slide open on its iron track, scraping and screeching. A blast of wind and a wall of noise roared into the car, whipping dust into their faces and snatching the air from their lungs. The world outside was a terrifying, beautiful blur of red rock and pale green scrub, flying past at a dizzying speed. The ground was a ribbon of sand and stone, impossibly far below. He turned to her, raising his voice to be heard over the roar. "They'll be back, or they'll be waiting at the next water stop. This is our only chance." Her mind reeled. He couldn't mean... She looked at the rushing ground, at the lethal blur of the landscape. It wasn't a chance. It was suicide. He saw the paralysis in her face. He didn't have time for persuasion. He strode back to her, his movements sure and steady despite the violent rocking of the train. He grabbed her arm, his grip firm but not bruising, and pulled her to her feet. She stumbled against him, her legs as weak as a newborn colt's. "I will hold you," he said, his voice a raw command against the wind. "Tuck your head. Keep your arms in. When we land, roll. Do you understand?" She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. The fear was a cold, solid thing in her stomach. But looking up into his calm, determined face, she found a tiny, improbable spark of trust. His certainty was more powerful than her terror. He didn't hesitate. He wrapped one strong arm around her waist. Pulling her tight against his side, she was little more than a bundle of rags and bones against his solid frame. "Now," he grunted. He moved toward the open door, half carrying, half dragging her with him. For one heart-stopping moment, they stood on the edge, silhouetted against the vast, empty sky. The wind tore at them, trying to rip them apart. Below, the world was a maelstrom of motion. It was like standing on the precipice of the world. Then he jumped. The fall was a stomach-lurching, breathless void. There was no up or down, only a chaotic tumble through roaring air. Ava squeezed her eyes shut and buried her face against his chest, her world reduced to the solid feel of his arm around her and the rough fabric of his shirt. They hit the ground with a brutal, bone-jarring impact. It wasn't the flat earth she had imagined, but a steep, sandy embankment that sloped down from the tracks. Jed took the brunt of the landing, his body absorbing the shock as they crashed into the loose soil. They tumbled, a chaotic mess of limbs and flying dust, rolling over and over down the short, steep hill. Thorny branches whipped at them, tearing at their clothes and skin. They came to a stop in a tangle of limbs at the bottom of the embankment, hidden from the tracks by a thicket of mesquite. The world was blessedly, shockingly still. The thunder of the train was already fading, its clatter and shriek receding into the distance. A sound from another lifetime. It left behind a silence so profound it rang in Ava's ears. For a moment, neither of them moved. Ava lay sprawled across Jed's chest, her cheek pressed against the hard ground. Every part of her body ached. A sharp pain shot through her ankle. She could taste blood and dust. Jed grunted, a low sound of pain and effort. He pushed himself up, dislodging her gently. He sat for a moment, his head bowed, taking stock. His duster was torn, and a long, bloody scratch ran down his forearm. He ignored it. His gaze was already scanning their surroundings, assessing, planning. "Can you stand?" he asked, his voice rough. Ava pushed herself up onto her elbows. Her whole body screamed in protest. She looked at her ankle. It was already beginning to swell, a dark bruise forming under the grime. She tried to put weight on it and gasped, a sharp, involuntary cry of pain. Jed was beside her in an instant. He didn't waste time with questions. He knelt, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as they examined the injury. "It's not broken," he pronounced after a moment. "Sprained, badly." He looked up at the tracks. The train was gone, a wisp of smoke on the horizon, but its absence offered no comfort. They were exposed, injured, and on foot in the middle of the Arizona Territory, and their hunters knew they had been on that train. He stood up, his gaze sweeping the landscape. The sun was low in the sky, a fiery orange ball sinking toward the jagged peaks of the distant mountains. The world was bathed in a golden, ethereal light, and the shadows of the saguaros and rock formations stretched like long, grasping fingers across the desert floor. It was beautiful, but it was a deadly beauty. The desert was an enemy that killed with heat, with thirst, and with the creatures that stalked its nights. "We have to move," he said, "before they come back, before it gets dark." He reached down and, with no more effort than if he were lifting a saddlebag, he pulled her to her feet. He positioned himself at her side, instructing her to put her arm around his neck. He wrapped his own arm around her waist, taking most of her weight onto his own solid frame. And so their desperate flight began. They moved away from the tracks, plunging deeper into the wilderness. Every step for Eva was an agony. The sharp rocks and thorny brush seemed to conspire against her, tearing at her dress, scratching her legs. She stumbled repeatedly, her vision blurring with pain and exhaustion. But each time she faltered, Jed's grip would tighten, his strength a silent, unwavering support that kept her moving forward. He did not speak a word of encouragement, nor a word of complaint. He simply moved, his pace relentless, his eyes constantly scanning the path ahead, the ridge lines, the sky. After what felt like an eternity, as the last sliver of the sun bled purple and orange along the horizon, he found what he was looking for, a place where the earth was scarred by a deep, winding arroyo, a dry creek bed carved by the flash floods of 1,000 summer storms. He led them down into its sandy, rock-strewn channel. Here, they were hidden from view. But he wasn't finished. He left her leaning against the cool wall of the arroyo and clambered back out. She watched him gather a pile of dry grass and greasewood branches. He moved with a purpose that was both fascinating and frightening. He arranged the pile a good 50 yards from their position, in the opposite direction from which they intended to go. He added a handful of green leaves he stripped from a hardy bush. Then, using his flint and steel, he coaxed a tiny spark into a flame. A thick, acrid column of white smoke began to billow up into the twilight air. A false signal fire. Anyone looking for tracks would see the smoke and assume they had gone that way. It was a simple, clever deception that might buy them the time they desperately needed. He slid back down into the arroyo as true darkness fell, the smoke from his decoy fire a ghostly plume against the star-dusted sky. The heat of the day was already bleeding out of the land, replaced by a sudden, chilling cold. The desert night had arrived. He found a shallow alcove in the wall of the creek bed, a place where an overhang of rock offered some small protection from the wind. He guided her into it, and they sank to the ground, their backs against the packed earth. The silence returned, deeper and more complete now, broken only by the whisper of the wind over the rim of the arroyo and the distant, lonely cry of a coyote. Eva huddled into herself, shivering, the pain in her ankle a dull, throbbing drumbeat. Exhaustion was a physical weight pressing her down, yet, as she sat there in the cold, immense dark, she realized something profound. She wasn't afraid. The terror that had been her constant companion for days, the fear of Silas and his men, had receded. It was still out there, a threat in the darkness, but it was no longer inside her. She looked at the man beside her. He was not resting. He was sitting with his back against the rock, his rifle laid across his lap, his hat pulled low. He was watching the darkness, listening to the sounds of the night, a silent, tireless sentinel. The wind was cold, the ground was hard, and 100 dangers lurked in the shadows, but she had never felt safer in her life. She watched the way the faint starlight glinted off the barrel of his rifle, the steady, even rise and fall of his chest. He was a stranger who had asked for nothing, a man of stone and silence who had thrown himself from a moving train and carried her through a landscape of thorns, all to protect a girl whose name he didn't even know. He turned his head slightly, and for a moment she thought he was looking at her, but his gaze was fixed on the star-dusted horizon. He was a part of this wild, unforgiving land, as quiet and as resilient as the ancient rocks around them. Eva pulled the tattered remains of her dress tighter around her legs, the throbbing in her ankle a distant thing now. She closed her eyes, and, for the first time in a long time, it was not the faces of her hunters that she saw in the darkness, but the image of a silent man, sitting guard under a canopy of stars. And in the heart of the desolate wilderness, she slept. The cold of the desert night did not surrender easily. It clung to the shadows in the arroyo long after the eastern sky had turned a bruised purple. Then a soft, pearly gray. Ava awoke to a stillness so profound it felt like the world was holding its breath. The first thing she felt was the throbbing in her ankle, a dull, insistent ache. The second was the weight of Jed's duster, which he had draped over her while she slept. He was already awake, perched on a rock a few yards away, his rifle resting across his knees. He wasn't looking at her, but was watching the rim of the arroyo, his posture a study in patient vigilance. He seemed less like a man and more like a part of the landscape, as ancient and unmovable as the stones around him. When he heard her stir, he turned his head, his pale eyes, clear and sharp in the dawn light, held no surprise, only a calm assessment. He rose and came to her, his movements economical. Without a word, he knelt and gestured toward her injured ankle. She extended her leg, wincing as he gently unwrapped the makeshift bandage he'd torn from his own shirt the night before. The swelling was worse, the skin a mottled canvas of purple and blue. His touch was clinical, his fingers probing the bone and sinew with a practiced confidence that suggested he had tended to many injuries, both on man and beast. Nothing broken, he confirmed again, his voice a low rasp in the morning quiet. He then produced a strip of leather from a pouch on his belt and, with surprising dexterity, bound her ankle tightly, creating a supportive brace that immediately lessened the sharpest pains. He stood and offered her his hand. She took it, and he pulled her to her feet. The world swayed for a moment, but his grip was a steady anchor. "We walk," he said, and that was all. The journey that followed was a blur of grim determination. The sun climbed the sky, and the heat returned, a physical, oppressive force. They kept to the low ground, following the winding paths of dry washes and skirting the open plains where they might be seen. Jed set a slow but relentless pace, his body a constant, solid presence at her side, taking her weight whenever she faltered. Ava focused on the ground in front of her, on the next step, and the one after that. The pain in her ankle became a constant companion, a fire she learned to live with. Her world shrank to the rhythm of their movement, the crunch of his boots on the gravel, her own ragged breathing, the solid feel of his arm supporting her. She lost all track of time. The sun was a hammer, the landscape a repeating vista of red rock, thorny brush, and the skeletal arms of saguaros. Just when she felt her strength would give out completely, when the pain and the heat threatened to swallow her whole, he stopped. They stood at the edge of a wide, flat mesa. Below them, the land fell away into a shallow, protected valley, and there, nestled against the base of a long, protective ridge, was a cabin. It wasn't a grand ranch house. It was a small, solid structure of hewn logs, chinked with mud, with a stone chimney that sent a thin, lazy curl of gray smoke into the impossibly blue sky. A simple porch ran along the front, and to one side stood a well-built corral where two horses stood swishing their tails in the shade of a lean-to. A handful of chickens scratched in the dust near the cabin door. It was not a place of wealth or ease, but it radiated a sense of stubborn permanence. It was an anchor, a small point of human endeavor holding its ground against the vast, indifferent wilderness. Mine. Jed said. The single word held more meaning than a chapter in a book. It spoke of ownership, of safety, of a destination reached. As they made their way down the gentle slope, the cabin door creaked open. A small boy appeared on the porch, hesitating on the threshold. He was perhaps 7 years old, with a shock of unruly brown hair and wide, serious brown eyes. He was small for his age, with a watchful stillness that seemed unusual in a child. He wore patched trousers and a simple shirt, and he held a carved wooden horse in one hand. He watched them approach, his gaze fixed on Ava, a mixture of curiosity and apprehension in his expression. When they reached the bottom of the slope, Jed stopped. He gently released Ava's arm. letting her lean against a post of the corral. He walked toward the boy, who did not run to him, but waited. Jed reached the porch and simply placed a large hand on the boy's small shoulder. It was a gesture of immense, unspoken affection. "Noah," Jed said, turning his head back toward Ava. "This is Ava." The boy, Noah, looked from Jed to Ava and back again. He gave a small, shy nod but did not speak. Jed's gaze met Ava's. "He needed a place," he explained, his voice even. "I had one. His former master was not a kind man." The simple statement explained everything. This small, silent cabin was a sanctuary not just for Jed, but for this boy as well. Jed had rescued him, just as he was now rescuing her. Jed led her inside. The interior of the cabin was one large room, spare and functional. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A sturdy table with 2 chairs stood in the center. In one corner was a bed, neatly made, and in the other, a smaller cot, which was clearly Noah's. The space was tidy but carried the unmistakable air of being inhabited solely by males. A stack of unwashed plates sat by a water basin. A shirt with a torn sleeve was slung over a chair, and a fine layer of dust coated the surfaces that weren't in daily use. Jed pointed to his own bed. "Rest," he commanded. He then went to the fireplace, stirred the embers, and put a pot of coffee on to boil. The exhaustion Eva had been holding at bay washed over her in a tidal wave. She sank onto the bed, the mattress filled with straw and corn husks, and it felt more luxurious than any feather bed she could imagine. She fell asleep almost instantly, the scent of wood smoke and brewing coffee a lullaby of safety. When she awoke, the light slanting through the single window was the soft gold of late afternoon. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then the memory of the past 48 hours crashed down on her. The train, the jump, the desperate flight. She sat up, her heart pounding, but the only sounds were the gentle clucking of the hens outside and the soft whisper of the wind around the corners of the cabin. Jed and Noah were gone. Her first instinct was panic had they left her. But then she saw that a clean cup of water and a piece of dried jerky had been placed on the small crate beside the bed. Jed's rifle was gone, but his saddlebags were still on the floor. They were out working, not gone for good. She looked around the small, quiet room. It was a space of profound silence, a silence that felt not empty, but full. It was a shelter. A man and a boy had offered her shelter without asking a single question. They had not asked her name, where she came from, or what she was running from. They had simply seen a need and met it. A wave of something fierce and determined rose up in her, pushing aside the fear and the exhaustion. She had been a victim, an object to be sold, a piece of property to be hunted. But here, in this quiet cabin, she could be something else. She would not be a burden. Pushing herself off the bed, she tested her ankle. The leather brace held it firm, and while it still ached, she could put some weight on it. She limped to the water basin and saw the stack of dirty dishes. She found a rag and a small block of lye soap, and she began to wash. Her movements were slow, careful, but methodical. She washed each plate, each tin cup, and set them on a cloth to dry. When she was done, she saw the broom a bundle of stiff grass tied to a stick leaning in a corner. She began to sweep the floor, her movements creating a soft, rhythmic shush-shush sound that was the first domestic noise the cabin had heard in a long time. She swept the dust and dirt from the corners, her actions deliberate and focused. She found the shirt with the torn sleeve in a small wooden box on a shelf. She discovered a needle and a spool of black thread. She sat at the table, the afternoon sun warming her back, and began to stitch the tear. Her stitches were small and neat, a skill her mother had taught her long ago, in a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. She was not just mending the cloth. She was mending a small part of herself, piecing her world back together one tiny, careful stitch at a time. She didn't ask if she could stay. She didn't wonder what would happen tomorrow. She simply worked. She filled the buckets with fresh water from the well, the rope biting into her soft hands. She found the nesting boxes behind the cabin and gathered 4 warm, brown eggs, cradling them in the hem of her torn dress. She took possession of this small world through the act of caring for it. Jed and Noah returned as the sun was setting, casting long, peaceful shadows across the valley. They carried an axe and a bundle of firewood between them. They stopped on the porch, and for a moment, they just stood there, looking in through the open door. They saw the clean floor. They saw the neat stack of clean dishes. They saw Eva sitting at their table, a needle in her hand, the last of the sunlight catching in her pale hair. She looked up as they entered, her expression calm, her eyes clear. She did not offer an explanation. She simply met their gaze. Noah looked from the clean room to Eva, a flicker of wonder in his serious eyes. Jed's expression was, as always, unreadable. He looked at the neatly mended sleeve on the shirt that lay folded on the chair. He looked at the eggs she had placed in a bowl on the table. His gaze lingered on her for a long moment, taking in the quiet industry, the unspoken declaration she had made. He didn't say thank you. He didn't say, you can stay. He walked to the fireplace, laid the new wood beside it, and began to build up the fire for the evening. Noah, taking his cue from Jed, quietly took the water bucket and went to refill it. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was no longer the stark, lonely silence of 2 solitary males. It was a shared silence, a domestic silence, warmed by the presence of a third person. It was the quiet hum of a home, fragile and new, being built not with words, but with the simple, steady actions of people who had found a safe harbor, a small, flickering candle in the vast, dark expanse of the territory. Days bled into one another, marked not by a calendar, but by the movement of the sun across the valley. A quiet, unspoken rhythm took root in the small log cabin. It was a rhythm built of simple tasks and shared silences. Eva would rise with the first pale light, her limp less pronounced each morning, and stir the fire. She learned the particular way Jed liked his coffee, strong and black, and would have it waiting for him when he came in from tending the horses. Noah, who had at first been a small, watchful shadow, slowly began to emerge into the light of her gentle presence. He never spoke much, a habit learned from his silent protector, but he would bring her things a smooth, gray stone from the creek bed, a feather from a hawk, a misshapen wildflower. He would sit at the table while she kneaded dough for biscuits, his eyes following the movement of her hands, a quiet awe on his face. She spoke to him in a low, soft voice, telling him simple stories about the shapes of clouds or the names of birds. And for the first time since Jed had found him, the boy's shoulders began to lose their permanent, defensive hunch. Jed watched it all. He was a man who observed the world with an intense, quiet focus, and he missed nothing. He saw the way Eva's presence was sanding the rough edges off their solitary existence. He saw the way Noah's eyes now held a light that had been absent before. He saw the neat stitches in his mended clothes, the clean swept floor, the way the cabin was slowly transforming from a simple shelter into something that felt perilously close to a home. He never commented, never offered a word of praise, but when he came in from the corral, he would leave his hat and gun belt on the peg by the door, a small, unconscious gesture of trust, and sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, she would catch him watching her, his expression unreadable but for a deep, considering stillness in his pale eyes. Eva, in turn, learned to read the language of his silence. A slight nod of his head after a meal was a compliment. The way he placed a freshly filled bucket of water by the stove where she worked was an act of consideration. He learned the rhythm of her tasks and would often complete a chore he knew she was about to do, clearing a path for her day without ever speaking of it. Their lives began to weave together, 2 threads of silence and one of a child's quiet watchfulness, creating a fragile, unnamed tapestry. But the past was a shadow that lay just beyond the cabin door, and Eva knew it could not be held at bay forever. The safety she felt here, this fragile peace, was built on a foundation of unanswered questions. They had given her sanctuary, and they deserved the truth. One evening, after a simple meal of rabbit stew and biscuits, the time came. Noah was asleep on his cot, his breathing soft and even. The wooden horse clutched in his hand. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows that made the small room feel intimate and safe. A wind had begun to rise outside, a low, mournful moan as it swept down from the high ridges, rattling the single window in its frame. Eva sat at the table, her hands clasped in her lap. Jed was on the other side, cleaning his rifle with a quiet, methodical focus. The soft scrape of the oiled rag on steel, a familiar, comforting sound. The silence stretched, filled only by the fire and the wind. She took a deep breath, the air shuddering as it entered her lungs. "Jedediah," she said. His hands stilled. He rarely heard his full name, and her use of it was a signal that this was something of consequence. He did not look up immediately, but his entire being became focused on her, a listening stillness that was more potent than any direct gaze. "You took me in," she began, her voice low and tight. "You and Noah. You didn't ask why I was running. You just helped." He slowly lifted his head. His eyes met hers across the table, clear and patient in the flickering firelight. He waited. The story came out in a torrent, a painful flood of words she had held back for too long. "My father, he has a farm back in the territories. A good one, once. But the drought, and his weakness for cards. It took everything. He fell into debt, a deep debt, to a man named Silas." At the mention of the name, Jed's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, the only sign that he was connecting the pieces. "Silas is not a good man," Eva continued, her gaze dropping to her tightly clenched hands. "He owns a saloon in Dusty Fork. He owns other things, too, things and people. My father had nothing left to give him. No money, no cattle, nothing but me." Her voice broke on the last word, a small, sharp sound of shame and betrayal. She forced herself to go on, to pull the whole ugly truth out into the light. They made a deal. My father's debt would be cleared. In exchange, I was to be his wife. It was not a proposal. It was a transaction. I was sold, like a head of cattle. The bitterness in her voice was sharp enough to taste. They called it a wedding, but everyone knew what it was. Silas, he likes things young. He likes to break them. The townspeople, they whispered about it. They felt pity, but no one would dare stand up to him. He owns that whole town. She finally looked up, her eyes swimming with unshed tears, pleading for him to understand the depth of her desperation. The ceremony was to be on a Sunday, on Saturday night, while they were all drinking in the saloon to celebrate his acquisition. I took nothing. I just climbed out my window and ran until I couldn't breathe. I hid in a dry ditch for a day before I found the tracks and jumped on that train. I didn't know where it was going. I only knew it was going away. She paused, taking another shaky breath. This was the hardest part, the part that defined her, that separated her from the woman everyone assumed her to be. Those men on the train, Silas and the others, they were coming to collect me. They think, I know what they must think of me. A runaway bride, a girl who belongs to their boss. She looked directly at Jed, her gaze unwavering now, fierce with the need to be believed. But he never touched me. Jedediah, the wedding never happened. I have never been with any man. The confession hung in the air between them, stark and vulnerable. She had laid the barest, most private part of her soul on the table, and now she waited, bracing for his judgment, for the flicker of disgust or disbelief that would tell her she was truly alone. Jed did not move. His face was a mask of shadow and firelight. He did not speak. He did not offer a single word of comfort or condemnation. The silence stretched, long and deep, punctuated by a sudden, violent gust of wind that slammed against the cabin and made the window pane rattle furiously in its frame. Ava's hope began to wither in that vast, empty silence. His lack of response felt like a judgment in itself. She had burdened him with her sordid past, and now he was retreating into his impenetrable fortress of quiet. A cold knot of despair formed in her stomach. Then he moved. He slowly, deliberately, set down his rifle and the cleaning rag. He stood up, his tall frame seeming to fill the small room. He looked not at her, but at the remnants of their dinner still on the table. He picked up his own empty plate and bowl, then reached across and gently took hers. He carried them to the wash basin in the corner and set them down without a sound. He walked back to the table, picked up the tin cups, and wiped the surface clean with a damp cloth, his movements steady and unhurried. Ava watched him, her mind a whirl of confusion and hurt. Was this his way of dismissing her, by simply erasing the moment, by returning to the mundane rhythm of chores as if she had said nothing at all? When the table was clear, he walked to the rattling window. The wind was howling now, a true desert gale that spoke of a coming storm. The simple wooden latch was loose, and the glass shook with every gust. He examined it for a moment, his brow furrowed in concentration. He went to the woodpile by the hearth and picked up a small wood chip. Returning to the window, he carefully, precisely, wedged the chip into the gap between the sash and the frame. The rattling stopped. The window was secure. He tested it once with the flat of his hand, then turned from the window. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time since she had finished her story. His face was still unreadable, but his eyes held a deep, quiet gravity. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a nod of pity or of pardon. It was a nod of acknowledgement, of acceptance. And in that moment, Ava understood. His silence had not been a judgment. It had been his way of listening, of giving her the space to speak her truth without interruption. His actions were his response. Clearing the table was not a dismissal. It was an act of shared living, a quiet statement that the rhythms of their life here would continue, unchanged by her past. Securing the window against the storm was not a chore. It was a promise. It was his way of saying, "The storm is outside. In here, you are safe. I will keep you safe." The words he did not say were clearer than any spoken comfort could ever be. He had heard the ugliness of her story, and his answer was to make her world a little bit safer, a little more secure. He didn't need to tell her that he believed her, or that her past didn't matter. He showed her. A profound sense of peace settled over her, so deep and complete it almost brought her to tears. She had given her past to this silent man, and he had not recoiled. He had simply taken it, folded it into the quiet fabric of their lives, and latched the window against the wind. For Eva, who had only ever known words to be weapons or empty promises, this silent language of action was the most profound declaration of acceptance she had ever known. The fragile peace held for almost a week. It was a time of quiet healing, of unspoken understanding. The valleys seemed to conspire in their sanctuary, offering up cool mornings, warm, sun-drenched afternoons, and nights so still Ava could hear the beating of her own heart. She grew to love the small, solid cabin, the way the light fell across the wooden floor in the morning, the scent of pine and dust and clean, dry air. The fear that had been her constant companion began to feel like a distant memory, a bad dream from another life. This new life was measured in the rhythm of small things: the weight of an axe in Jed's hands as he split firewood, the intent frown on Noah's face as he whittled a piece of scrap wood into a new animal, the soft bubbling of a stew on the hearth. They were a family of circumstance, bound not by blood but by shared silence and a common need for refuge. One morning, the peace shattered. Ava was outside, shaking a braided rug free of dust, when the two horses in the corral suddenly went rigid. Their heads shot up, ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring as they stared at the high ridge that guarded the entrance to the valley. A low, nervous whinny broke the morning stillness. Jed was at the well, halfway through drawing a bucket of water. He froze, his hand still on the rope. He didn't look at the horses. He didn't need to. He looked at the ridge, his face becoming a mask of cold, hard granite. His pale eyes, which had softened in the quiet days, were suddenly chipped from ice. "Eva," he said, his voice a low, urgent command. It was the first time he had used her name with such force. "Inside, get Noah. Stay away from the window." The tone, more than the words, sent a bolt of pure, cold terror through her. The dream was over. The past had found them. She dropped the rug and scrambled inside. Noah was on the floor, lining up a row of pebbles. "Noah, come on," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. He looked up at her, his serious eyes wide with confusion, but he obeyed instantly, a testament to the trust she had built with him. She pulled him to the far corner of the cabin, behind the large stone fireplace, and pushed him down, shielding his small body with her own. Jed came through the door a second later, moving with a fluid, deadly grace. He didn't run, he flowed. He grabbed his rifle from its pegs on the wall and his gun belt from the post. As he buckled it on, he spoke, his voice calm and stripped of all emotion. "They're coming down the ridge, 3 riders." He didn't have to say who they were. Silas, Bart, Finn. The names were a venomous taste in Eva's mouth. Jed moved to the single window, staying to the side, peering out through a tiny gap in the frame. They've seen the smoke. They know we're here. The world outside was silent for a long, terrible moment. Eva could hear nothing but the frantic thumping of her own heart and Noah's quick, frightened breaths beside her. Then the silence was obliterated by a deafening crack. The window exploded inward in a shower of splintered glass and wood. A hole, the size of a man's fist, appeared in the wall on the other side of the room. Eva screamed, a thin, terrified sound she couldn't hold back, and pressed Noah tighter against the stones of the hearth. "Down," Jed roared, and he was already on one knee, his rifle up and pressed to his shoulder. He fired back through the shattered window, the report of the big gun a deafening concussion inside the small cabin. He worked the lever, ejected the smoking casing, and fired again, his movements a blur of practiced efficiency. The next few minutes were a maelstrom of noise and violence. Gunshots cracked from outside, answered by the thunder of Jed's rifle. Bullets tore through the log walls, sending splinters of wood flying like deadly insects. The air grew thick with the acrid stink of gunpowder. Through it all, Jed was an island of lethal calm. He moved from the window to the door, using the solid wood for cover, never wasting a shot, his face a mask of absolute concentration. He was no longer the quiet homesteader. He was a warrior, protecting his territory with a cold, unforgiving fury. Eva, huddled behind the fireplace, felt utterly helpless. This was a man's world of violence and death, a language she did not understand. All she could do was hold on to the trembling boy beside her and pray. One of the attackers, the big man Bart, had worked his way around to the side of the cabin. With a savage roar, he kicked in the door, the heavy wood slamming open on its leather hinges. He filled the doorway, a huge, menacing silhouette against the bright morning light. Jed spun, his rifle coming up. He fired, and Bart grunted, stumbling back a step, a red stain blossoming on his thick shoulder. But he was not down. He lunged forward, a pistol in his hand, firing wildly. Jed dropped to the floor, rolling behind the heavy wooden table. A bullet that would have taken his head shattered a clay pot on the mantelpiece instead. As Jed came up on his other side, the wiry form of Finn slipped in through the door behind Bart. Now they were 2 against 1. Inside the confined space of the cabin, Jed's rifle was too long to be effective at such close quarters. He dropped it and drew his Colt, the fluid motion a testament to years of practice. He fired, and Finn yelped, diving for cover behind a stack of crates. But the distraction was all Bart needed. The big man charged, not bothering with his gun, but instead swinging his own rifle like a club. Jed tried to bring his pistol around, but he was too slow. The heavy wooden stock of Bart's rifle crashed against the side of Jed's head with a sickening, wet thud. Jed's eyes went wide with shock, then glazed over. He crumpled to the floor without a sound, his gun skittering away across the wooden planks. He lay completely still, a dark line of blood beginning to seep into his hair from above his temple. No! The cry was torn from Eva's throat, a sound of pure, soul-deep agony. The world seemed to stop. The protector was down. The wall between them and the wolves had fallen. Bart stood over Jed's still form, breathing heavily, a triumphant, brutal grin on his face. From behind the crates, Finn emerged, a nervous, predatory look in his eyes. His gaze swept the room and landed on the corner where Eva was huddled with Noah. "Well, well," Finn sneered, his fear replaced by a foul bravado. "Look what we have here, the boss's little bird." He started toward them, his pistol held loosely in his hand. Eva's mind was a blank wall of terror. There was nowhere to run. Suddenly, Noah, driven by a fear that was greater than his instinct to hide, scrambled to his feet. "Leave her alone," he cried, his small voice cracking with a child's desperate courage. Finn's eyes lit up with a cruel idea. In 2 quick strides, he was on the boy. He grabbed Noah by the arm, yanking him in front of him as a shield. He pressed the cold muzzle of his pistol against Noah's small temple. The boy froze, his body rigid with a terror beyond comprehension. "Nobody move," Finn hissed, his darting eyes flicking between Eva and the still grinning Bart. "The boss wants the girl, but the boy is insurance." Eva's terror, the paralyzing fear for her own life, was suddenly burned away, replaced by a white-hot, protective rage so fierce it made her vision go red at the edges. They would not touch this child, not while she drew breath. Her gaze fell on Jed's colt, lying on the floor only a few feet from where he had fallen. She didn't think, she acted. She launched herself from the corner, scrambling across the floor on her hands and knees. "Hey," Bart shouted, taking a step toward her. But she was faster than he expected. Her fingers closed around the heavy, checkered grip of the pistol. It was shockingly heavy in her hand, a cold, alien weight. She had never held a gun in her life. She pushed herself to her knees, raising the weapon with both hands to steady it. The barrel wavered, a terrible, heavy black circle pointing in Finn's direction. Her arms trembled from the strain. Finn laughed, a high, nervous sound. "You ain't gonna shoot, little bird. You ain't got the—" His words were cut off by a deafening roar. Eva squeezed the trigger. The gun kicked back with a brutal, shocking force, slamming her back on her heels. The sound was a physical blow, a thunderclap that left her ears ringing. For a moment, she saw nothing but the flash of orange fire from the muzzle. When her vision cleared, Finn was screaming. He had dropped Noah, staggering backward, clutching at his shoulder where a ragged, bloody hole had appeared in his shirt. The bullet had gone wide of his heart, but it had shattered his collarbone. Noah, released, scrambled away, back to the safety of the fireplace, his face a mask of shock. Bart stared, his jaw slack with disbelief. In that split second of hesitation, the odds changed again. A new voice, dry and cracked like old leather, came from the shattered doorway. "Drop it! Silas!" A third man stood there. He was old, his face a roadmap of wrinkles under a battered hat, but his eyes were sharp and clear. He held a long, heavy buffalo rifle, and its gaping muzzle was pointed directly at the chest of the third attacker, Silas, who had just been stepping into the cabin. Silas froze, his hand hovering over his own pistol. He looked from the old man's steady rifle to the bleeding Finn, to the furious, trembling girl with the smoking colt, and finally to the unconscious man on the floor. His greasy smile was gone, replaced by the pinched look of a man who has badly miscalculated. The old man's name was Saul. He'd been a trapper, a scout, and for the last 10 years, a part-time hand for ranchers in the territory. He'd been tracking a mountain lion when he heard the gunfire echoing through the valley. He knew this cabin. He knew the quiet man who lived in it. "I said, drop it," Saul repeated, his voice dangerously soft. Silas, ever the opportunist, made his decision. He wasn't going to die for a runaway girl. Not here, not now. He slowly raised his hands. Bart, seeing his boss surrender, reluctantly lowered his own weapon. The fight was over. The sudden silence was as shocking as the noise had been. It was filled with the sound of Finn's pained moans, the ragged gasps of Eva's breath, and the low, menacing howl of the wind through the broken window. The cabin was a wreck. Furniture was overturned. The walls were pocked with bullet holes, and the floor was littered with glass and spent casings. But the physical damage was nothing compared to the human cost. Eva dropped the heavy Colt as if it had burned her. The rage drained away, leaving her weak and trembling. Her eyes went to Jed. He hadn't moved. He lay in a growing pool of his own blood, his face a ghastly, unnatural white. She scrambled to his side, her hands hovering over him, afraid to touch him, afraid of what she would find. "Jedediah," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Jedediah, please." He didn't answer. He didn't stir. He was utterly, terrifyingly still. The man of stone, her protector, her silent anchor, was gone, lost in a dark, silent world where her voice could not reach him. The sanctuary had been defended, but its guardian had fallen. The world outside the cabin ceased to exist. Time dissolved into an endless, agonizing cycle of light and shadow, marked only by the state of the man lying motionless on the bed. After Saul had marched Silas and his wounded men out of the valley at the end of his buffalo gun, promising them a swift journey to the afterlife if they ever returned, an unnerving silence had descended. The immediate threat was gone, but a far more terrible one had taken its place. The fear of being captured was a sharp, hot thing. The fear of losing Jed was a cold, bottomless ocean, and Eva was drowning in it. With Saul's grim, practical help, they had moved Jed to his bed. The old man, his face a mask of concern, had cleaned the wound as best he could. It was a deep, ugly gash above his temple where the rifle stock had connected, the skull beneath bruised and battered. "Head wounds are a tricky business," Saul had muttered, his voice gravelly. "Ain't nothing to do but keep him clean, keep him quiet, and pray. The rest is up to him and the Lord." Saul stayed for a day, helping to board up the broken window and repair the splintered door. He showed Eva where Jed kept a small store of medicinal herbs and salves. Then, with a sympathetic look and a promise to check back in a few days, he left. He knew this was a vigil that had to be kept by those who remained. And then they were three, a silent, broken man, a terrified girl, and a watchful boy, adrift in a sea of quiet desperation. Eva's life shrank to the small, sacred space around Jed's bed. She became a creature of fierce, relentless purpose. She tore strips from her own petticoat for fresh bandages. She boiled water constantly, using it to clean the wound with a tenderness that bordered on reverence. She learned the geography of his unconsciousness, the shallow, rattling breaths that terrified her, and the deeper, more even ones that offered a sliver of hope. Her hands, once soft, became chapped and raw from the lye soap and the hot water. She brewed thin broths and gruels from their meager supplies, trying, mostly in vain, to spoon a few drops past his slack lips. Most of it would just dribble down his bearded chin, and she would wipe it away with a gentle cloth, her heart constricting with each failed attempt. During the day, a fragile, hollow routine took hold. She would force herself to leave his side for a few minutes at a time to tend to the necessities. She fed the chickens, drew water, and made simple meals for herself and Noah, though every bite felt like ash in her mouth. She moved through these tasks like a ghost, her thoughts always in the cabin, always with the still figure on the bed. Noah was her silent shadow. He seemed to understand, with a child's deep and intuitive wisdom, that words were useless. He did not ask questions. He did not cry. He simply stayed near, while Eva sat by the bed. Noah would sit on the floor, a piece of charcoal in his hand, drawing on scraps of wood or flattened pieces of cardboard from a supply crate. He drew horses, mountains, and the cabin, but mostly, he drew a tall man with a hat, standing beside a small boy. His drawings were a silent prayer, a stubborn refusal to accept a world without his protector in it, when Ava's shoulders would begin to shake with silent, suppressed sobs. He would creep closer and gently place his small hand on her arm, a gesture of solidarity that spoke more than any words of comfort could. The nights were the worst. The darkness seemed to amplify the silence, making Jed's stillness all the more profound, all the more terrifying. The wind would whisper around the corners of the repaired cabin, sounding like a mournful sigh. Ava would sit in a chair by the bed, a single candle burning, its flame a tiny, defiant speck of light against the overwhelming dark. In those long, lonely hours, she talked to him. Her voice was a low, desperate whisper, a thread of sound spun into the vast emptiness. "Jedediah," she would murmur, leaning close, as if her voice alone could pull him back from the precipice. "You have to wake up. Noah needs you. He's being so brave, but he needs you." She would bathe his face with a cool, damp cloth, her fingers tracing the hard, unyielding lines of his brow, his cheekbones. She smoothed back his dark hair from the bandages, her touch a desperate caress. "You saved me," she'd whisper into the night. "You jumped from a train for me. You can't leave now. That wouldn't be fair. You can't save someone and then just leave them." The fear of losing him was so profound it was a physical ache in her chest. She had spent her life running from men, from their cruelty, their demands, their ownership. But this man, this silent, solitary man, had asked for nothing and given everything. He had shown her a world she never knew existed, a world where strength was used for protection, not domination, and where silence could hold more kindness than 1,000 pretty words. The thought of that world vanishing, of that silence becoming permanent, was more than she could bear. It was one thing to be hunted. It was another thing entirely to be left utterly alone. One night, the fourth since the attack, she felt herself begin to break. The exhaustion was a heavy cloak, pulling her down. Hope had worn thin, frayed by the endless, unchanging stillness of the man in the bed. His breathing was shallow. His skin had a pale, waxy sheen under the candlelight, and a fever had taken hold, making his brow hot to the touch. She knelt by the bed, pressing her forehead against the rough blanket that covered his chest. The tears she had held back for days finally came, hot and silent. They were not tears of self-pity, but of a grief so deep it felt like it was tearing her apart. She was mourning a future she had only just begun to imagine, a quiet life in this valley, a life of safety and unspoken affection. "Don't go," she wept, her voice a choked, broken thing. "Please, Jedediah, don't you dare leave me. I'm not running anymore. There's nowhere else to go. This is it. This is home. But it's not a home without you." She stayed like that for a long time, her quiet sobs the only sound in the room, until the well of her tears ran dry, leaving her hollowed out, empty, and utterly defeated. She pushed herself up, her body aching, and slumped back into the chair. She stared at his face, her gaze tracing the lines she had come to know so well. This was it. There was nothing more she could do. And then his eyelids fluttered. It was so faint. She thought she had imagined it, a cruel trick of the flickering candlelight. She leaned forward, her heart stopping in her chest, every fiber of her being focused on his face. Slowly, as if they were lifting an immense weight, his eyelids opened. His eyes were not the clear, pale blue she knew. They were clouded, unfocused, struggling to make sense of the light and shadow. They drifted around the room, taking in the log walls, the ceiling, before finally, slowly, settling on her face. He stared at her. There was no recognition at first, only a deep, primal confusion. He was a man coming back from a great and terrible distance. Ava held her breath, not daring to move, not daring to hope too much. She watched as the fog in his eyes slowly began to clear. She saw the moment the confusion gave way to a flicker of understanding. He knew her. He was seeing her. He didn't speak. He couldn't. His throat worked, but no sound emerged. His gaze held hers, and in that long, silent look, 1,000 unsaid words passed between them. He saw the tear tracks on her face, the exhaustion in her eyes, the raw, desperate hope. She saw the return of the man she had feared lost forever, the slow rekindling of the steady, quiet spirit within. Her own eyes filled with fresh tears, but these were not tears of grief. A single drop spilled over and traced a path down her cheek. "I'm not running anymore," she whispered, repeating the words she had spoken into the darkness. But this time they were not a plea. They were a statement, a vow. His gaze flickered down from her face to her hand, which was resting on the edge of the bed, her knuckles white, very slowly, with an effort that seemed to take all the strength he possessed. He lifted his own hand. It trembled, the muscles weak from disuse. He laid it over hers, his fingers, rough and calloused, curled weakly around her own. The touch was faint, barely a pressure, but it was an anchor. It was a connection. It was an answer. He did not speak. He did not need to. In the quiet of the small, battered cabin, with the first hint of dawn painting the sky outside, he simply held her hand, and Eva knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that he had heard her. He was back. The dawn that followed Jed's return to consciousness was not a dramatic reversal, but the beginning of a slow, arduous climb from a deep, dark valley. His awakening had not vanquished the injury. It had only given them a starting point for the fight ahead. The days that followed were a testament to the stubborn, quiet resilience of the human body and the even quieter power of unwavering care. Jed's strength returned in increments so small they were almost imperceptible. His recovery was a landscape Ava learned to navigate with painstaking patience. The first victory was the day he was able to drink a full cup of broth without her help, his hand trembling but determined. The next was the day he sat up on his own, his back against the rough-hewn headboard, his face pale and beaded with the sweat of effort, but his eyes clear. Each small milestone was a silent, shared triumph. He rarely spoke. The effort seemed to cost him dearly, and his voice, when he did use it, was a rough, cracked version of its former self. But his eyes were always articulate. They followed Ava as she moved about the cabin, a quiet, constant assessment. He watched her mend Noah's trousers, her head bent in concentration, the needle flashing in the lamplight. He watched her bank the fire at night, her movements sure and practiced. He watched her stand on the porch in the late afternoon, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains, a deep weariness in her posture. He was an observer, gathering the details of the life that had been built around him while he was lost in the darkness. Noah was a barometer of the cabin's fragile hope. The day Jed first sat up, the boy, who had been quietly drawing on the floor, looked up and a slow, wide smile spread across his face. It was the first time Eva had seen him truly smile, and the sight was like a ray of sunshine piercing a week of storm clouds. He grew bolder, bringing his charcoal drawings to the bedside to show Jed, who would look at each one with grave seriousness and give a slight, approving nod. About a week into his recovery, Jed was finally able to stand, leaning heavily on the bedpost. From there, he graduated to taking a few shaky steps, his hand braced against the cabin wall. His progress was slow, frustratingly so for a man accustomed to such physical competence. But he never complained. He simply accepted the new, temporary reality and worked at it with the same quiet determination he applied to everything. It was during this time, when a fragile sense of normalcy had begun to settle over them, that Eva found the flower. She had taken a bucket to the small, spring-fed creek that ran at the far end of the valley, a short walk that she now cherished for its solitude. The air was clean and crisp, and the violence that had torn their world apart felt blessedly distant. There, growing in a sheltered spot between two sun-warmed rocks, was a single defiant bloom of desert marigold. It was a splash of impossible, vibrant gold against the red earth, a small testament to the tenacity of life in this harsh, beautiful land. She knelt, looking at it for a long moment. It was a thing of simple, uncomplicated beauty, and it felt like a gift. She plucked it carefully, its thin stem fragile between her fingers, and carried it back to the cabin, cupped in her hand as if it were a precious jewel. Jed was sitting in the chair by the hearth, a blanket over his knees. He was staring into the fire, his thoughts 1,000 miles away. Eva walked over to the bed and placed the flower in the tin cup of water on the small crate beside it. She didn't say a word. She didn't present it to him or draw his attention to it. She simply left it there, a quiet offering of color and life in the dim, Spartan room. She went about her tasks, preparing a thin stew for their midday meal. After a few minutes, she glanced over and saw that Jed had turned his head. He was no longer looking at the fire. He was looking at the flower. His gaze was fixed on the small, golden bloom, and his expression was one of deep, unreadable contemplation. He looked at it for a very long time. Later that evening, Eva noticed the flower was gone from the cup. A small pang of disappointment went through her. Perhaps he had tired of it and tossed it into the fire. But then she saw what he was doing. He was sitting at the table, and before him was a small, leather-bound ledger. It was the one book she had seen him possess, a practical thing filled with columns of figures and scrawled notes, a history of horses sold, supplies bought, and miles traveled. It was the written record of his solitary life. With movements that were still slow but now precise, he carefully opened the book to a clean page near the back. He took the small, golden flower and laid it gently on the paper. He then closed the book, pressing down on the cover with the flat of his hand. He held it there for a moment, his eyes closed. He was preserving it. He was taking this small, fleeting piece of beauty she had brought him and making it a permanent part of his record, pressing it between the pages of his life. Eva stood in the shadows by the hearth, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. He had not said a word, but his action was a poem. It was a declaration more profound than any sonnet. He was telling her that her small gift mattered, that it was something worth saving, something of value. That small, silent gesture was a turning point. It was as if a dam had broken, and a current of unspoken affection began to flow freely between them. Their communication evolved, becoming a rich and complex language of quiet actions. A few days later, Eva was exhausted after a long morning of washing their clothes in the creek, scrubbing them clean on the rocks. Her back ached, and her hands were raw, as was her habit. She went to sit on the edge of the porch for a few moments of rest before starting the evening meal. But when she got there, she found something waiting for her on the wooden step. It was a tin cup, filled to the brim with cool, fresh water from the well. Dew was beating on its cool surface. Jed had seen her exhaustion. He had anticipated her need for a drink and her desire to rest in that specific spot. He had made the trip to the well and back for her, a small journey that was still a significant effort for him, and left this simple comfort waiting. She sank onto the step and drank the water, and it was the sweetest, most refreshing drink she had ever tasted. Another afternoon, she was busy grinding their small supply of corn into meal, a tedious, dusty job. Noah, playing outside, tore a large hole in the knee of his only good pair of trousers. He came in looking crestfallen, holding the damaged garment up for her to see. She sighed, her shoulders slumping. It would have to be patched. Another task in a day already full of them. Leave it on the chair. Noah, she said, her voice tired. I'll fix it after supper. An hour later, she finished with the cornmeal and turned, wiping her dusty hands on her apron. She stopped. Jed was sitting in his chair, but he was not resting. He had the boy's small trousers laid across his lap. In his large, somewhat clumsy hands, he held a needle and thread. He was sewing. His stitches were not as neat or as small as hers. They were large, robust, and slightly crooked, the work of a man more accustomed to mending leather harnesses than cotton cloth. But he was mending the tear with intense, focused concentration. He was taking one of her burdens and making it his own. He was helping to care for the boy, participating in the creation of their shared home. She watched him for a long moment, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. This was what love looked like, not in flowery words or grand, passionate gestures, but in these small, silent acts of service. It was a cup of cold water left on a porch step. It was a child's trousers, mended with clumsy, earnest stitches. It was a wildflower, pressed between the debts and credits of a lonely man's life. They were not lovers. They had not shared a kiss. They had not spoken a single word of love. But love was there, in the quiet spaces between them. It was in the way he watched her, his eyes speaking of a gratitude and a tenderness he could not voice. It was in the way she anticipated his needs, knowing he was hungry or tired before he did. It was in the way Noah moved freely between them, a small, quiet shuttle weaving their separate lives into a single, strong cord. The cabin was no longer just a shelter, and they were no longer just three strangers thrown together by circumstance. They were a constellation, each a point of light, held together by an invisible, gravitational pull of mutual care and profound, unspoken understanding. The love story was being written, not with ink, but with every quiet, deliberate gesture that said, clearer than any words, "You are not alone. I am here. We are home." The seasons began to turn. The relentless heat of the Arizona summer gave way to the crisp, clear air of autumn. The sun's angle lowered, painting the valley in hues of old gold and deep, bruised purple in the mornings and evenings. A chill crept into the night air, a sharp, clean cold that made the warmth of the cabin's hearth a true sanctuary. Jedediah was almost himself again. The deep wound on his head had healed into a pale, jagged scar, mostly hidden by his dark hair. The unsteadiness in his legs was gone, replaced by his familiar, ground-covering stride. He had resumed his work, mending the corral fence that had been damaged in the attack, chopping a formidable stack of firewood for the coming winter, and spending long hours gentling the two horses, his low, rumbling voice a constant, soothing murmur in the clear air. But something had changed. The wall of solitude he had built around himself for years had been breached, not by the violence of the attack, but by the quiet siege of Eva's care. He moved with the same quiet efficiency, but his eyes were different. They sought her out. When he was working near the cabin, his gaze would lift from his task and find her on the porch, shaking out a blanket or mending a shirt. A long, silent look would pass between them, a conversation that needed no words. Their life had settled into a rhythm as steady and natural as the changing seasons. It was a life of shared labor and comfortable silence. Eva would cook, and Jed would clean the plates. He would chop the wood, and she would stack it. When Saul rode through one afternoon on his way to Prescott, he'd taken one look at the quiet domesticity of the cabin, at the way the man and woman moved around each other without speaking, and had simply nodded, a slow, knowing smile creasing his weathered face. He hadn't stayed long. He seemed to understand that he was on the edge of something sacred, a world too fragile for outsiders. One evening, the first true cold snap of the season descended on the valley. A fierce wind swept down from the high peaks, rattling the windows and finding its way through every tiny chink in the log walls. Inside, the fire roared in the hearth, a bulwark of warmth and light against the wild. Dark night. Noah, worn out from a day of helping Jed, had fallen asleep almost immediately after supper, and was now a small, still lump under a thick wool blanket on his cot. The cabin was quiet, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind. Ava was sitting on a low stool by the hearth, her hands wrapped around a warm tin cup of herbal tea. The heat felt good against her chilled fingers. Jed was in his usual chair, not working, not cleaning a weapon, but simply watching the flames, his long legs stretched out before him. The firelight played across the hard planes of his face, softening the lines around his eyes and casting his beard in a warm, reddish glow. The silence between them was no longer a void, but a rich, comfortable space. It was a blanket they shared, woven from trust and unspoken affection. But tonight, for Eva, the silence felt different. It felt incomplete. For weeks, a question had been living in her heart, a small, persistent thing that she had pushed down, afraid to give it voice. She had told him the facts of her escape, of the deal her father had made, but she had never spoken of the deeper truth, the one that society, and men like Silas, cared about most. She had told him she had never been with a man, but the words had been part of a larger, desperate confession. Now, in this quiet, peaceful space, she felt the need to offer that truth again, not as a defense, but as a gift. It was the last, most vulnerable piece of herself, and she felt a deep, inexorable need for him to have it. She watched his profile, the strong line of his nose, the firm set of his jaw. He was a good man, a man of quiet honor, and he deserved the whole truth, offered freely, without the taint of fear or desperation. She took a slow breath, her heart beginning to beat a little faster, a nervous, fluttering rhythm against her ribs. She set her cup down on the stone hearth. "Jedediah," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He turned his head slowly, his gaze leaving the fire and settling on her. His eyes were calm, patient. He waited. She looked down at her hands, twisting them in her lap. "When I told you about Silas, about why I ran," she paused, gathering her courage, "there was something else, something I need you to know." He remained silent, his attention absolute. He did not prompt her or rush her. He simply gave her the space, his stillness an invitation. She finally lifted her head, her gaze meeting his, clear and direct in the wavering firelight. "You know I was to be his wife," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "And you know I ran before that could happen, but I need you to know that it wasn't just him. It was everyone," she faltered, searching for the right words. "Do you know, I've never been with anyone." The question hung in the warm, fire-lit air between them, fragile and intensely personal. It was the final secret, the last wall around her heart. She was offering him the key. She watched his face, her breath caught in her throat, bracing herself for she didn't know what. Surprise, pity, or worse, a flicker of triumphant possession. The look of a man who has just learned he is the first to stake a claim on a new piece of land. Jed's expression did not change. There was no surprise, no flicker of any emotion she could name. He simply looked at her, his pale eyes seeming to see straight through to the terrified, hopeful heart of her. He did not ask for details. He did not question her. He accepted her words with the same quiet gravity with which he accepted the sunrise or the turning of the seasons. It was a fact, and he accepted it. He held her gaze for a long, silent moment, and in that look, she felt a profound and complete understanding pass between them. He understood what it had cost her to say those words. He understood the lifetime of fear and vulnerability she had just placed in his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, rough murmur, softer than she had ever heard it. "That doesn't change a thing. Ava, The simple words landed in her soul like a gentle rain after a long drought. It doesn't change a thing. He was not interested in what she was or was not. He did not value her for her lack of a past. He valued her for her. The relief was so profound it made her feel lightheaded. He leaned forward slightly in his chair, the firelight catching the earnest, solemn light in his eyes. I just want your yes. It was not a demand. It was not a proposition. It was a question, the most important question of her life, stripped bare of all adornment. He was not asking to possess her. He was not asking for her submission. He was asking for her consent. He was offering her a choice, the one thing no one else ever had. Your yes. It was a phrase of immense, world-altering power. The last of her fear dissolved, washed away by the simple, profound respect in his voice. This quiet, solitary man, who spoke so few words, had just spoken the most beautiful words she had ever heard. A slow smile touched her lips, a genuine, radiant smile that reached her eyes. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Yes, she whispered. The word was a breath, a prayer, a quiet promise in the firelit dark. He stood up then, his movement slow and deliberate. He crossed the small space between them and stood before her. He did not reach for her immediately. He just stood there, his tall frame blocking the light of the fire, his presence filling her world. He extended his hand. She placed her hand in his, and he gently drew her to her feet. He was so close now. She could feel the warmth radiating from his body. She had to tilt her head back to look up into his face. His expression was one of solemn tenderness, a look of such profound reverence it made her heart ache. He raised his other hand, his calloused, scarred fingers impossibly gentle as he cupped her jaw. His thumb stroked her cheek, a soft, questioning touch. He was giving her every chance to pull away, to change her mind. He was still waiting for her yes. She leaned into his touch, a silent, final confirmation. He lowered his head. His kiss was not what she had imagined a kiss would be. There was no sudden passion, no fierce, demanding pressure. It was a slow, deliberate claiming of a promise. It was achingly gentle, as if he were touching something infinitely precious and fragile. His lips were firm but soft, tasting of wood smoke in the cold night air. It was not a kiss of taking, but of giving. It was a vow, a pledge, a silent oath sworn in the heart of the wilderness. He was sealing her whispered yes with one of his own. He was promising her safety. He was promising her respect. He was promising her a home. For Eva, who had only known the fear of a man's touch, this was a revelation. It was a homecoming. It was a feeling of being utterly, completely, and irrevocably safe. For Jed, it was a moment of profound truth. As he held this woman, as he felt the soft, untutored response of her lips, he understood the true depth of the gift she had given him. It wasn't her innocence. It was her trust. She had given him everything. And in that moment, holding her as the fire crackled and the wind howled outside, he felt a fierce, protective certainty settle into the very marrow of his bones. He had spent his life as a solitary wanderer, a man who moved through the world without ties. But that life was over. He knew with a clarity that was as absolute as the stars in the vast, dark sky, that this was it. This woman was the first soul he had ever truly allowed into his own, and she would be the last. Forever had just begun. The morning arrived not with a thunderclap, but with the soft, gentle inevitability of the dawn. When Ava opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was the familiar pattern of the log ceiling. But the first thing she felt was a profound and bone-deep sense of peace. The world had not changed, and yet everything was different. The fear that had lived like a cold stone in her gut for as long as she could remember was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady warmth that had nothing to do with the blankets covering her. She slipped out of the bed, which she now thought of as hers, and saw that Jed was already awake. He was standing by the open cabin door, a tin cup of coffee in his hand. looking out at the valley. He was not wearing his gun belt. The sight of him, unguarded and at ease in the doorway of their home, sent a fresh wave of warmth through her. He heard her stir and turned, his pale eyes finding hers in the dim morning light. He didn't smile. Jed was not a man for easy smiles, but the hard lines around his eyes seemed to soften. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement of the new world they had woken up in. He had a cup of coffee waiting for her by the hearth. As she took it, her fingers brushed against his, and the simple, accidental touch was as intimate as the kiss they had shared. They drank their coffee in a comfortable silence, a silence that was no longer a space between them, but a space that held them both. It was the silence of people who have nothing to hide and nothing to prove, the easy quiet of a shared beginning. Just as the sun crested the high eastern ridge, flooding the valley with golden light, the sound of an approaching rider broke the stillness. For a fleeting, heart-stopping moment, the old fear tried to reassert itself in Ava's chest, but it found no purchase. She looked at Jed. He was calm, his posture relaxed. He had already recognized the rider's gait. It was Saul, leading a pack mule laden with supplies. The old man rode up to the cabin, his wrinkled face creased in a benevolent smile. He had brought sacks of flour and cornmeal, salted pork, and a small crate of tinned goods from Prescott. "Figured you folks might be running low," he said, his voice a dry rasp. He swung down from his saddle with the easy grace of a man who had spent a lifetime on horseback. His sharp eyes took in the scene, the quiet man and woman standing together on the porch. The peaceful valley bathed in morning light. He saw the way they stood near each other, not touching, but connected by an invisible thread. He saw the profound, settled peace in Eva's eyes. "Looks like the world set itself right again in this valley," he observed, and it was the only comment he made. The day's work began without discussion, as if they had been planning it for years. The attack had left its scars not just on them, but on the homestead itself. The corral fence was a wreck, several posts shattered by stray bullets, the rails splintered and broken. It was a stark, physical reminder of their vulnerability. Jed retrieved a post-hole digger and a heavy wooden mallet from the lean-to. He looked at Ava. "The corral," he said. It was not a command, but a statement of shared purpose. "I'll help," she replied, and the words felt solid and true in her mouth. Saul, meanwhile, surveyed the cabin. "That porch roof took a hit," he announced to no one in particular. "A man needs a solid roof over his porch. It's a matter of principle." He began unloading his own tools from his saddlebag, a man content to lend his skills to the mending of this small, wounded world. As Jed began the hard, grueling work of digging new post holes in the rocky soil, a new sound filled the air. It was the sound of Noah, who had emerged from the cabin, his belly full of biscuits and his heart full of a 7-year-old's boundless energy. He was not quiet and watchful today. He was running in the open space between the cabin and the corral, a long stick in his hand, making swooshing noises as he fought imaginary bandits and chased lizards into the brush. Occasionally, a peal of pure, unadulterated laughter would bubble up from him, a sound that had been absent from the valley for far too long. It was the sound of a child who feels safe. It was the sound of a future. Ava watched him for a moment, a fierce, protective love swelling in her chest. She turned back to Jed. He had stopped his digging, his gaze on the boy, and a look of profound, quiet satisfaction was on his face. This was what he had fought for. This was what he had almost died for. The work was hard. Jed's muscles, still mending from his long convalescence, bunched and strained as he drove the heavy digger into the recalcitrant earth. Ava became his partner in the truest sense of the word. She cleared the loose rocks from his path. She brought him water when the sun grew high and hot. When he set the new, heavy locust posts into the holes, she was there to hold them steady, her small hands braced against the rough wood, while he packed the earth and rock in around them, tamping it down until the post was as solid as the mountain behind them. They moved in an unspoken rhythm, a dance of shared purpose. He would gesture with his head, and she would know to bring him the mallet. She would see him squinting at the line of the fence, and she would fetch the string line to ensure the next post was true. They did not need words. They were building more than a fence. They were building a life, post by post, rail by rail. They were creating a new boundary, not to keep the world out, but to define the space that was theirs, the safe harbor they would defend together. Saul's hammer rang out a steady, percussive rhythm from the porch, a counterpoint to the heavy thud of Jed's mallet. Noah's laughter was the melody. It was the music of a home being born from the ashes of violence. Late in the afternoon, they paused. 3 new posts were set, solid and straight, and a new section of railing was in place. The corral was beginning to look whole again. Jed leaned against the new fence, wiping a line of sweat and grime from his brow with the back of his arm. He looked at their handiwork, his chest rising and falling with his deep breaths. Ava stood beside him. She looked at the fence, at the solid, tangible proof of their shared labor. She looked at Saul, putting the finishing touches on the repaired porch roof. She looked at Noah, now sitting in the dirt, carefully building a small fortress out of pebbles. Her heart was so full of a quiet, powerful emotion that she could not have named it. It was gratitude. It was love. It was a profound sense of belonging. She looked at the man beside her. He was covered in dust and sweat. His knuckles were scraped, and a smudge of dirt was on his cheek. He had never looked more handsome. He had taken her in, a terrified, broken creature, and had given her not just shelter, but a reason to stand and fight. He had given her a place to put down roots. Slowly, she lifted her hand. She did not reach for his face or his arm. She placed her hand, palm down, over his own large, calloused hand where it rested on the top rail of the new fence. It was not a lover's caress, not a plea for affection. It was a statement. It was a gesture of solidarity, of partnership. It was the hand of an equal, placed beside his. It said, "Your work is my work. Your home is my home. Your life is my life." Jed went very still. He looked down at her small, work-roughened hand covering his. He looked at her face, at the quiet strength and unwavering loyalty in her eyes. The girl who had trembled in the shadows of a freight car was gone. In her place stood a woman, strong and resilient, who had faced down her demons and chosen to stand her ground. Here, with him. He did not speak. He did not need to. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his hand over and curled his fingers around hers. His grip was not gentle. It was firm, strong, and absolute. It was not a gesture of possession, but of profound, unbreakable connection. It was a soldier's grip, a farmer's bond. It was the silent, powerful answer to her silent, powerful statement. His hand, holding hers, said, "Yes, forever." They stood like that for a long time as the sun began to sink behind the ridge, casting their long shadows across the land they now shared. The wind whispered through the valley, carrying the scent of pine and dust and the faint, sweet smell of Saul's pipe tobacco. From the girl who had whispered, "Sir, may I slip under your coat a plea for invisibility, for a momentary escape from a terrifying world," to the woman who now stood in the open sun, shoulder to shoulder with the man who was her shield, her partner, and her home. The terror of the chase was over, and the long, quiet, beautiful work of living had just begun. Thank you so much for listening to our story. If you enjoyed it, let us know where you're listening from in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts. Please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like, and if you'd like to give it an extra boost, hit that hype button to help this story be heard by more people. We appreciate your support.